Hello and welcome back to another video series dealing with Chapter 4 Process Costing. Um, for the sake of your time, I'm going to skip over a few things in the lecture videos. Reason being is they're pretty easy, I think. I think if you read the textbook, answer some of the study guide questions, the concepts are pretty easy to get, okay? So I'm going to stick to the more difficult themes of this chapter in this video, and then in the following video, actually following probably 2 or 3 videos, we're just going to do nothing but examples and walkthroughs, okay? So if you read the chapter, you see that, hey, there are some similarities and there are some differences between job order costing and process costing, okay? Remember, when we're talking about process costing, we're dealing with homogeneous products, meaning you can't tell the difference between one unit from the next unit, okay? Think of red Crayola crayons, right? There's no difference between the first red Crayola crayon made versus the millionth red Crayola crayon that was made, right? Can't tell the difference. They're all the same. And that's what process costing caters to, okay? So again, the textbook in the study guide talked about the similarities and differences. Very easy. I don't need to, bore you with that stuff. Cost flows, right? Materials, labor, overhead. How do they flow through a processing system? Pretty much identical to a job order costing, okay? So I'm going to skip over that. The Chapter 2 videos, I think really, or Chapter 3 rather, I'm sorry. Chapter 3 videos, I believe I talked about the cost flows and whatnot. If I do it again here, it's going to be just redundant, okay? So I'm going to skip through that. But if you do have questions, reach out to me. Send me a text. Say, hey, you know what? Still having some difficulty with those cost flows. Can you help me out? I would be glad to. Not a problem, okay? But where I really want to start off with is where some of the actual computation of the costs, okay? Because that's what really gets a little difficult, okay? Now, the first thing that we need to recognize, it was actually one of the questions in the study guide, right? What are the 3 key concepts that you need to understand before you start, before you start getting into process costing? Well, the first thing that we needed to really understand is equivalent units, right? And we need to recognize that these equivalent units can actually be calculated in 2 ways, FIFO or the average cost method. Now, the book talks specifically about average cost method, and then there's an appendix that talks about FIFO. Don't worry about FIFO. Not going to cover it. We're going to stick with the average cost method. It's a lot easier. And being that, this is all online, we got time constraints, we're just going to stick with the weighted average method, which is very easy to use, okay? So we need to, before we can really get into that, we need to look at the characteristics of the weighted cost, okay? And one distinct characteristic about this weighted average method, and this is really what makes it different from the FIFO, is that this weighted average method makes no distinction between work that was done in the prior period versus work that was done in the current period, okay? So really what it does is it takes all those units and costs from the prior period, from the current period, and it blends them together, okay? That's number 1. Number 2, the equivalent unit of production for department, okay? These are the number of units that are transferred to the next department, plus any equivalent units in that department's ending WIP account, okay? I know that's just verbiage. This will become a lot clearer when we work through an example. The takeaway here is that when we're dealing with these equivalent units of production, okay, remember how the process costing system works, right? We take a raw material and we send it through a process, and there's, you know, a number of different processes. There could be 2 processes, there could be 3, 4, whatever. The point is that each process or each department adds its own direct materials and as it adds its own labor and adds its own conversion costs. Okay, so what we're saying here is that for each equivalent unit of production, or I'm going to say EUP, for a department, that's the number of units that were transferred to the next department plus the any equivalent units in that department's ending WIP. And we'll see this a lot in a lot more detail when we run through an example. The second key concept we need to recognize is that, guess what? Direct labor, it's not a very big it's not a big amount. Okay, so when we're looking at the processing process, right, or the processing system rather, we use a lot of machinery, so there's going to be a lot of overhead. Okay, so since direct labor makes up a small portion of those conversion costs, a lot of times we're just going to take our direct labor and our manufacturing overhead and lump it together as a conversion cost. Now, conversion cost should not be new, right? Because we learned this in chapter 1 when we were talking about all those definitions, okay? So we should know what conversion costs are. If you don't, again, reach out to me, let me know, and I'd be happy to just talk with you and just talk about the material and what you have questions on. Totally not a problem, okay? So, the next thing we need to look at, or the third concept, or the third key concept, is these equivalent units, right? What are equivalent units? Well, equivalent units, actually, let me go here. Equivalent units, what are they, right? Well, we define the equivalent unit as the product of the number of partially completed units. So we're dealing with partially completed units here, right? That means that we're going to need to figure out a percentage, okay? So think about it this way. An equivalent unit says we have a partially completed product, okay? But we've added some material and we've added some conversion costs, meaning labor and overhead, okay? Well, the equivalent unit says, well, with respect to direct material, it might be 100% complete, okay? With respect to conversion costs, it might only be 25% complete. So what we do is we multiply the number of partially completed units by the percent that they are completed, okay? So we have to calculate this equivalent units. It's really important, and we're going to see at the end of the process, no pun intended, meaning at the end of the calculation, that basically what we're doing is taking equivalent units and figuring out, okay, how much should we have based on the percent of being completed, okay? So we got to calculate these equivalent units because of departments, right? Because remember, the units are moving through a process, and each department is putting its input, whether it be material or conversion cost, into that product. So because each department is going to have some partially completed units in its beginning as well as its ending inventory, right? So these partially completed units complicate our job in determining what is the department's output for a given period, what are the units that should be assigned to that output, okay? So basically what we're going to have to do at the end of the day is we're going to have to restate the ending work in process inventory as if it were comprised of a smaller number of fully completed units. Okay, that's a pretty important concept. So let me repeat that again. So remember, the equivalent units, all we're doing when we calculate equivalent unit is nothing more than restating the ending WIP as if we were, or as if the WIP was included a bunch of smaller number of fully completed products. Okay, and again, when we go through the calculations, I'll point it out and say, okay, here's where we're restating ending inventory. We're saying, hey, based on our inputs, our ending inventory is comprised of a smaller number of fully completed units. Okay, very, very, very important. And we're going to get a lot of practice on this as far as calculating equivalent units, right? So all we really want to do here is multiply the number of partially completed units by that percentage of completion. Okay, so let's just say, for example, that 2 half-completed products are equivalent to one completed product. So when we're restating that ending inventory, basically we're saying, hey, we have 2 half-completed products. Well, technically, that's equivalent to having one completed unit, okay? So if we had 10,000 units that were 70% completed, the equivalent units that we have, or we could say that the 10,000 units that are 70% complete are equivalent to 7,000 completed units. That's really all we're saying, okay? So we can look at this here, right? So let's do a quick check. For the current period, Jones started with 15,000 units and completed 10,000 units. They're leaving 5,000 units in process that are 30% completed. How many equivalent units of production did Jones have for the period? Now, let's think about this. We know we need to multiply the partially completed units. Bear with me here. Actually, let's do this one. Okay, so we know we have to take the partially completed units, 5,000, by the percentage that they're complete. Well, that's 30%. So if we took 5,000 times 30%, that's what, 1,500. Well, 1,500 is not one of our choices, right? Remember, we started 15,000. We completed 10,000. So when we're trying to calculate the equivalent units, we take everything that was actually completed and transferred out. So we need to take these 10,000s, or 10,000 units. And to that, we need to add the equivalent units of the 5,000 partially completed units that are 30% complete. So our answer is 11,500, okay? And again, these units were completed and transferred out. We have to include them in our equivalent unit, okay? So let's work through an example here, right? First thing we got to do, step 1 says, hey, compute the equivalent units of production. Not a problem. We can do that very, very simply, okay? How do we do that? Well, remember there's 4 steps, right? In your study guide, one of the questions was, hey, list those 4 steps, right? Well, hopefully you wrote down for step number 1, compute the equivalent unit of production. We're using weighted average here. So what we have here are the units that were in WIP. So we have 300 units in WIP in the beginning. That's our beginning balance of inventory. We started into production in June, 6,000 units. Okay. The units that were completed and transferred out of Department A during June were 5,400. So that means at the end of the period, we have 900 units left in WIP. Okay. So check this out. They give us our percent completed with respect to material and with respect to conversion costs. Okay. So the first component in our calculation of equivalent unit is we need to identify the units completed and transferred out of the department in June. That was our 5,400. Okay. 5,400 units for material and conversion. So these are 100% complete with respect to material and with respect to conversion costs. You might say, well, wait a minute. How do you know? How do you know that these things are 100% completed? Because it tells me they were completed and transferred out. Okay. So first thing that we need to do again is calculate the first thing we need to do is, or the first component is calculate those equivalent units that were completed and transferred out. We have those 5,400 units. Okay. Second thing we need to do is identify the equivalent units of production in ending WIP with respect to material and with respect, or let's just focus on material now, with respect to material. Okay. So with respect to material, we have 450 units. Okay. How'd you get that? Well, again, we know that we have 900 units in our ending inventory. With respect to material, they are 60% complete. So that's how we get the 540. So the equivalent units of production in the department during June were the 5,940. Again, I'm adding what was completed and transferred out during the month plus that ending WIP. Okay? Plus that ending WIP. So I do that for material. Third thing I got to do is I got to figure out what is the ending units of production in the department during June for conversion costs. Okay? So I need to know what percentage was conversion costs completed. Well, if I go back here, they tell me that, with respect to conversion costs, the ending WIP is 30% complete. That means that of all the 900 partial units that are sitting at the end of, that are sitting in WIP at the end of the month, are 30% complete with respect to conversion costs. That means that we added 30% of the direct labor and the overhead. Okay? So let's go back and let's calculate the equivalent units in production for conversion costs. Well, it's 270. How'd you get 270? Well, again, I got 900 partially completed units. With respect to conversion, they're 30% complete. That's 270 units. I add the 5,400, the units that I completed and transferred out with respect to conversion, plus the 270 equivalent units that I have in ending WIP. That means that the equivalent units of production The end of the month for this department are $56.70. Again, that's with respect to conversion costs. Okay? Now, keep in mind that there's more often than not, there's usually always, I'd say most likely, going to be a difference in the equivalent unit calculation between the materials and the conversion costs. Okay? Why? Well, keep in mind that as materials are usually added at the beginning of the of production or of the production process, conversion costs are added during. Okay, so that's why we have a different percentage of adding materials and conversion costs. Okay. Now, next thing we got to do. Excuse me. Next thing we got to do is we got to calculate that equivalent units of production. And we have to know, excuse me, very sorry. What we have to know is the equivalent unit of production is always, 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 always going to equal the units completed and transferred out plus the units that still remain in the WIP. Okay? So if someone says, hey, how do you calculate the units in production or equivalent units in production? You know right off and if I were you, I'd definitely write this down. How do you calculate the units of production or equivalent units of production? It's always going to be equal to the units completed and transferred out plus the equivalent units remaining in ending WIP. Okay, and again, we did say that before. Nice little slide here that actually puts it in visual for us. Okay, so now we got to look at a different visual. Okay, so here we have a different visual that depicts the equivalent unit calculation for materials. Okay. So notice what we have here with respect to materials, right? 6,000 units were started, okay? How do you know that? Well, because they tell me beginning WIP was 300 units, okay? With respect to material, it was 40% completed, okay? We started 5,100 units and completed. Okay. The ending work in process units is 900 units, again, that are partially completed times the percent of completion with respect to material. Okay. So the units completed plus the equivalent units give us our equivalent units of production. Okay. Again, just a kind of a different way to look at it. We can do the same thing with the conversion costs, right? Again, we started 6,000 units, right? That's how much was started. But we started off with 300 units that were 30% complete with respect to conversion costs. We transferred out and completed 5,100 units, right? That's how we got our 5,400. The ending WIP consisted of 900 partially completed units, which were 30% completed with respect to conversion costs. That means we have technically 270 completed units, right? Or equivalent units, right? Because remember, basically 900 partially completed units that are 900 units that are partially or 30% completed are equivalent to having 270 completed units. That's really what we're saying here. Okay? Now, the next thing we need to do after we do that, after we do step one, which is calculate or compute the equivalent units of production, the second step is to compute the cost per equivalent unit. Okay, so again, this is the We're still dealing with that question. List out the four steps, right? So how do we compute the cost per equivalent unit? Well, it's very easy, okay? Notice what they give us here. They give us the beginning WIP, 300 units. They say, hey, 40% completed with respect to material, 20% completed with respect to conversion costs. And oh, by the way, here's the cost that we added of each of these, okay? Again, production started during June was still 6,000 units. Production completed and transferred out, 5,400 units. Nothing changed here, okay? Cost added to production in June. So here's what we added in June. We added $118,621 of material. With conversion costs, we added $81,130, okay? Ending WIP, still got 900 units, still 60% completed with respect to materials, still 30% completed with respect to conversion costs. So we're going to assume that these facts are all the same, okay? Or we're going to assume these facts, and then we're going to go ahead and say, okay, how do we calculate or compute that cost per equivalent unit based on these facts? Very easy, okay? So we have a formula that we need to use. Formula is very simple, okay? Keep in mind we're using the weighted average here. The cost per equivalent unit is the cost of the beginning WIP plus the cost added during the period divided by equivalent units of production. If I were you, I would write this down. Have it handy when you do your homework. Here's why. I guarantee there's going to be a problem that says, hey, compute the cost of equivalent unit. Well, right off the bat, you know how to calculate the cost per equivalent unit. I take the cost of beginning WIP plus the cost added during the period, and I divide it by my equivalent units of production. We already calculated the equivalent units of production in step 1, okay? So what do we do? Well, pretty simple. We have a schedule here with the costs and the equivalent unit information that we need, okay? The cost per equivalent unit for materials in total is, let's back up here. So we have our total costs, okay? But remember, with respect to material and with respect to conversion costs, we have different equivalent units, okay? So we can't just use this number and divide by the units we have in material and the units that we have for conversion, right? Can't do that. Why? Because we added different amounts of costs, okay? So again, that that formula said, hey, you take the cost of beginning WIP, which we have right here with respect to material. We're going to look right here first. With respect to material, it's $6,119. Then you add the cost added during the period. Well, with respect to material, we added $118,621. That means the total cost with respect to material is $124,740, okay? We're basically walking through the numerator portion of this slide. That's all we're doing, okay? With respect to conversion costs, what are my total conversion costs? That's easy. They already told us what the cost of beginning WIP is. It's $39.20. To that we need to add the cost added to, or the cost added during the period. Well, with respect to conversion costs, we added $81,130. We have in total cost with respect to conversion $85,050. Okay, guess what? We have our equivalent units. All we got to do is divide this total cost per or with respect to material by the equivalent units with respect to material. Okay, Very, very easy. So that's what we do here, right? We see it right here. This is just that equation. We're taking the top and the bottom, right? The numerator divided by the denominator. Well, that denominator is the equivalent units of production, which we see right here. The numerator is the cost of beginning WIP plus costs added during the period. Okay, so the equivalent or the cost per equivalent unit is $21 with respect to material. With respect to conversion costs, it's $15. So in total, we could say that the cost per equivalent unit is $36. That's in total. Okay. So now, the third step. The third thing we need to do is assign cost to units using the weighted average method. Very easy to do. Okay. Excuse me. Very, very simple and easy. Why? Because we already have the numbers, right? We already have the equivalent units. We already have the costs that were added during the period. We already have the ending or the equivalent units in ending inventory. We already have the number of units transferred out. We already have the costs associated with them. All we have to do in this step is just put everything together. It's all we have to do. Okay? So the first thing that we're going to do when we want to assign costs to units is we're going to calculate, or we're going to take actually, because we already calculated, is we're going to record the equivalent units of production in ending WIP. Okay? So keep in mind here, there's kind of a change in logic, right? Before we started, and let me rephrase that, when I say before, in the previous steps, we started at the beginning, right? Start at the beginning. What do I have in my beginning WIP? What did I add? Well, at the end of the period, here's what I got, okay? In step 4, we're going to change it up just a little bit, or I'm sorry, step 3. Step 3, which says assign cost to units using the weighted average method, we're going to start backwards, meaning we're going to start with our ending first, right? What's our ending WIP? Ending WIP. Well, we have the equivalent units, 540 with respect to material, 270 with respect to conversion costs, okay? Next, we take, or the second component for this calculation is that we need to record the cost per equivalent unit. We already figured that out. With respect to material, the cost per equivalent unit is $21. With respect to conversion cost, it's $15. Okay? Very easy. Then the third thing we need to do, or the third component, I guess you could say, of the calculation, is to compute the cost of ending work in process. Well, that's easy. We just multiply, right? With respect to material, 540 equivalent units at a cost per equivalent unit of $21 gives us $11,340. Same thing with conversion costs. Well, we have 270 equivalent units in ending WIP times that equivalent or cost per equivalent unit, which is $15. We get $4,050. So the total value of our ending WIP is $15,390. We got that by adding the cost of ending WIP with respect to materials plus the cost of ending WIP with respect to conversion costs. Okay? Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to compute the costs of units that were transferred out. Okay? This is easy. This is a plug number. Problem already told us, hey, by the way, you completed and transferred out 5,400 units. Okay. Well, if I transferred them out and completed them, they must be 100% complete with respect to material and conversion costs. Okay, that's why the numbers here are the same. That's why the numbers here are the same, because they're completed and transfer out. They're 100% complete with respect to materials and conversion. Next thing we need to do, There we go. Next thing we need to do is to plug in that cost per equivalent unit. Well, it's $21 with respect to material, $15 with respect to conversion costs. We need to multiply those up. And we see the total costs, or the total cost of units transferred out with respect to material are $113,400. With respect to conversion cost, $81,000. So that means that the total cost of units that were completed and transfer out are $194,400. Okay. The last step, we got to reconcile, right? Reconcile the costs. Super duper easy. Okay. Why is it easy? Because we have all the information. We did all the calculating. We did all the difficult stuff. Okay. So to prepare a cost reconciliation, first thing we need to do is we need to compute the costs that are to be accounted for. Okay. So what costs are we accounting for? Well, we first need to account for the cost of beginning WIP. We could see here, we could see here that the cost in beginning WIP is $10,039 plus the cost added to production during the period, $199,750. That gives us cost to be accounted for of $209,790. Okay, where the hell did these two numbers come from? Right? Where did these come from? Very easy. Let me show you. They were given to us. You just don't know that. Oh, there we go. They were given to us, right? Well, we actually calculated them out, okay? No, they were given to us, excuse me, right? If we add these up, those are the costs that were in beginning inventory, right? Just added those up. And we can see that again here on our calculation when we're trying to figure out what the total costs are. So these are the beginning and added. Those are the costs that we need to account for. Okay, and again, this step of reconciling, it's just a plug and chug because we already got the information we needed. Okay, so what's the next thing we need to do? Well, the next thing, or the second component, is that we need to account for, or we need the calculation of the costs that were added to production during the period. Okay, so we have that 199,751. So we add all those up. There we go. Okay. So now we got to compute, excuse me, the second cost that we need to account for are the cost of the ending WIP and the cost of the units that were transferred out. Okay. When we add those up, we get $209,790. The takeaway here, it's really simple, right? We start with the costs that were in beginning WIP, the costs that were added to production during the period. We compare those with the cost of ending WIP and the cost of the units transferred out. Okay? These two amounts need to equal. If they don't, we went wrong somewhere and we need to recheck our numbers. Okay? So that's it for the real lecture portion. What we're going to do next is we're going to come back. I'm going to work on the problems that are in the study guide, and then we're going to work on some additional problems, okay? These aren't you don't have to do them per se. I mean, I encourage you to work along with me. But these will hopefully help you in addition to, in addition to the study guide questions, and it'll um, add to your understanding, hopefully. So when you do the Connect problems, you shouldn't have that much difficulty. Okay, so tune back in for that one.